Hello, everyone. Let me jump up here to where I can see the comments. Welcome to the Walter Bosley channel. And another hot day in Southern California. Holy smokes, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you. Yikes. That's just the way it is this week. We're on day 2 of 4-day heat wave where it's over 100 degrees. And let me welcome everyone. Philip Blair, Tim Houston, CJ Star Monkey 73, Jackpot's here, Tessa 1111, and Megalith's here. Hello, Megalith. Thank you for being here. And scroll down here. Tim Houston, I think I already got. And Wes H. Hello. D. Dorothy is here. Welcome, D. Dorothy. Malia's here, of course. And I think I saw a couple of Billy W., Greg Betts. So hello. And over 100 here. Yeah, I love. I tell you, I'd rather have. People think I'm crazy. I'd rather have this than driving on ice. So that's the way I look at it. But first things first. As you know, NIMSACon's coming up in October, and in the first minute there, you saw the dates and the place, Sonora, California, October 11th through 13th. Go to walterbosley.com and get your tickets there and learn about, the details. And we look forward to seeing you there. Remember, the only way to experience NIMSACon is to attend NIMSACon. So we're looking forward to seeing as many of you up there as possible. And we've got a lot of folks here that are in California, and it's a lot easier for you to go. So think about it, walterbosley.com. Also, there's a little film that I'm in called Code 12, titled Code 12. And I would love for you guys to check it out. There's a link there with options to view. Yes, when you choose one of those options through our channel, walterbosley.com, we make some money on that, okay? And so if you're going to watch Code 12, and I hope you do, get it through our link at walterbosley.com. It's kind of a way to share the profits between the folks that are in the film. And I had a lot of fun. They flew me to Denver or Boulder. Yeah, it was downtown Boulder in this really cool old hotel. And I'm in it with Melissa, who's kind of the star and narrator and the thread puller through the whole film. And she is, Melissa Tittle, the one who is developing and producing Empire of the Wheel as a dramatic series. Okay, so anyway, there's been a lot of there's some news, some things moving forward on Empire of the Wheel, which I'll share with you in the coming days. But for now, please go check out Code 12 at walterbosley.com, and there's multiple options. Choose the one that's right for you, and it helps Malia and I continue doing what we do here. And there we go. Check that out. Today's guest. How's my sound, Malia? Am I sounding good? Because I had fiddled with this microphone, and I'm guessing it's okay. All right. So today's guest is HANS-DIETRICH. We have him back. This time to talk about Khemitology, Egyptian mysticism, his research that he's done while in Egypt. Thank you guys for that in the live chat. And also, he's going to share some of his experiences with some not mundane things while he lived in Nepal for some years. So without further ado, let's bring in our friend HANS-DIETRICH. Oh, your microphone's off there. Let me I think you've
It
muted.
is.
There
Thank you. There we are.
There you go.
How's it going, Walter? Thanks for having me back on.
Good. Hey, thanks for coming back on. This is great. This episode is I put it under the Lost Horizons series that I do because you had told me that you recently viewed one of the versions of the film recently, correct?
I actually viewed both of them, and so the first one I found was the 1973 version. I didn't realize it was a musical.
Yeah.
Which is kind of why I see why you said the 1937 version was better. I did find it interesting that a lot of the soundtrack in the 1973 version reminded me a lot about Conan the Barbarian, possibly similar recording.
Yeah, maybe the composer did both films.
But I did really like the 1937 version. I did find a version of it. It's very film noir in a sense. There's a lot of interesting, like, newsreel flashes. This is happening in the world today.
Yeah.
And it kind of got me into thinking about, okay, this topic of Shambala and Shangri-La has come up several times since the 1930s in movies. And so I wanted to get into a little bit of that. And so I definitely found it very interesting. But doing some research for the show, I wanted to go back and kind of figure out where exactly this whole Shangri-La and Shambhala notion started to popularize itself in the modern vernacular, in a sense. And so that's primarily where, I wanted to start all this. And I have a little bit of a slideshow that I put together for all of the area around Shambhala, Shangri-La, and some of the movies that it keeps appearing in from the 30s to modern day. And then some of my thoughts and my own studies abroad with my own thoughts about Shangri-La and possibly what and where and how it is. So I'm hoping that if I can present this, it will actually work. So let's find out.
Let's roll it. Probably should.
Let me know. Yeah, because I have multiple versions of this. Let me know if you can see my screen. And then if you can, I'm going to enter full screen mode. Are you viewing? Are you able to see it?
Oh, here we go. Yeah. There we go.
All right. So now that that's working, let's see if I can get this to work. I'm not sure if you're seeing my notes, but I'm going to go directly into the full slideshow. Okay, so Shangri-La or Shambhala, the hidden paradise, in a sense. And so in my research and the information that I've come across, I found that these 4 characters, or 5 characters in general, ended up doing their own researches into Shambhala, Sirius, and the Cintamani stone. And a lot of this started with Helena Blavatsky. She basically was in Tibet from 1868 to 1871, learning about Buddhist cultural mysticism, something that I've been very fascinated in, and a lot around her studies in theosophy. And so it's interesting that she went into Tibet and she had a guide named Jwal Kun, who also ended up being a channel for her understudy, Alice Bailey, somebody that you've talked a lot about, Walter. And so basically, Helena Blavatsky lived from 1831 to 1891. So she had a very healthy life for that time period in history. And her guide and teacher is this character in the middle, Jwal Kun, who lived from, who we don't really know much about him. Actually, you don't find a lot online about Jwal Kun. But this picture was taken around the 1860s in Tibet. And then Alice Bailey, who lived from 1880 to 1949, channeled Jwal Kun after he had passed and wrote several books through the Lucius Press about her experiences in Tibet and her channeling of Tibet, Shambhala, Shangri-La, and other elements. We then get into Alexandra David Neal. She was a French Buddhist and researcher, and she lived from 1868 to 1969. So she was a little over 100 years old when she passed, which is amazing. And so she went all over from Afghanistan into Pakistan, Kashmir, Ladakh, Tibet, Nepal, India, Bhutan, with her guide Yongden. And so in her thought, she took the more Suf and Persian name for Shambhala, which was Shami La Balk or Balal, and thought that Shambhala might be entranced through the Balk Valley in Afghanistan, which is very near to where the Turkmenistan border is. and also about 100 kilometers north of where the Bayan or Bamiyan Buddhas were that were sadly dynamited by the Taliban during the whole Afghanistan crisis. But there are so many caves riddled in this area, as we know, that there could be a possibility that her entrance to Shambhala exists here as well as other places. And then we get into Nicholas Rourke. And Nicholas Rourke is interesting because in the 1930s, President Roosevelt commissioned him through the Minister of Interior, I think his name was Wallace, to go into Tibet and find some of these, ancient Buddhist practices and ancient Buddhist ideas and sites, primarily because he had already lived in India from the early 1900s onward. And it said that in 1920, he was given a fragment of what is known as the Cintamani stone, and was commissioned to take it back into the sacred valleys of Tibet to find Shambhala and to return this fragment of the Cintamani stone, which was a meteorite that supposedly fell from Sirius about 20,000 years ago, and return this shard back to the stone. And this is interesting because this reminds me a lot of the Dark Crystal and the story behind that, where you're bringing back the shard basically to return it to complete the stone. And this gets into, about 20,000 years ago, we're told that a box descends from Mount Meru. Mount Meru is both a physical mountain in Tibet. It's near the border of Ladakh in northwestern Tibet. And found near its summit were 4 items that were in this box. And one was a piece of the Cintamani stone, this piece of meteorite. Another was the Vajra Dorje, which is a 4-sided lightning bolt that basically represents the 4 winds, or the 4 cardinal directions that make up a lot of the background of Vajrayana Buddhism. Then there's also the singing bowl. I have mine here, which when oscillated, it creates a transcendental state of meditation for the monks that are going into meditation, basically. And the 4th item in the box was called the Om Mani stone, or the Mani stone, which was a rock with the mantras Om Mani Padme Hum written around them. And basically, Om Mani Padme Hum directly translates to the jewel within the sacred crown. Well, if the crown chakra, the lotus, is your crown chakra, then the jewel within the lotus, which is what Om Mani Padme Hum basically means, is your seat of consciousness. And so this is your pineal gland. And so it's interesting that when you repeat the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, and you do your beads and you do your meditation, this will also take a practitioner into a somewhat transcendental state of meditation. And if we're looking at the physical reality of the lotus and the pineal gland, both of them transmute and also, filter small amounts of dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which would take a practicing meditation expert into a transcendental state of meditation just through the practice. And so it's interesting because the Cintamani stone is the most interesting out of the items that are in the box. It's depicted across time. Mystics, religious groups, and leaders alike have sought after it. Basically, Leonardo da Vinci put it in Salvator Mundi in 1499 as the Philosopher's Stone, or the Holy Grail, even though the Cintamani stone was known probably as the first Holy Grail to arrive on Earth. It grants its possessor longevity of life and extreme fortune and luck. We also find this aspect as the Kaaba stone in Mecca, which is located in the Kaaba building. Kaaba means the black cube, or the cube building. And it's interesting that the meteorite, or the piece of meteorite known as the Kaaba stone, also fell from Sirius during the Hajj, which is late July, early August. And so it's been placed inside of this silver yoni in the eastern corner of the Kaaba building in Mecca. So it faces its consort of Sirius rising in the east during the Hajj. And so it's interesting that we have a Saturnian reference here with the black cube. We have a goddess reference here with the silver yoni, and we have a Sirius reference here with the Cintamani stone. It was said to have been brought down from Mount Meru and given to the king of all worlds, which was the great Buddha of Shambala. And he was known to be basically the leader of the Great White Brotherhood, or the Brotherhood of Light, which is what Helena Blavatsky was looking for when she went into Tibet, so that she could then find the entrances to Shambhala. And in China, the Fu dogs have the Cintamani stone or the luck stone underneath their paws, and it's wrapped with the flower of life symbology. And so this has always been, fascinating, because all this points back to Shambala and this lost horizon of Shangri-La. And so we also find it, I like to go after movies because I love movie symbology in a sense. We find it in Wonder Woman 84. The Cintamani stone is called the Dream Stone, and when Max Lord crushes it and wishes to become the stone, he absorbs all of its power. But it's interesting because in Buddhist philosophy, he would have been known as Cintamani Loksavara, or the embodiment of the Cintamani stone and its power. And so other items that have fallen or come from Sirius in a sense, one of them is called the Buddhist Iron Man. And this is interesting because it's a piece of iron meteorite that also fell from the stars. They think it might have fallen from Sirius. But what's fascinating is on the armor of this Buddhist Iron Man, we have the swastika, and he is holding the Cintamani stone. And so there's this aspect that keeps coming back around through this philosophy in a sense. And so this gets into the movies. So here we are with Lost Horizon, right? Great movie, interesting. Frank Capras did a great job basically filming this. I didn't realize a lot of this was filmed in California. Much of it was filmed around Palm Springs, which is really interesting, with some shots around Los Angeles and some of the cave systems around Los Angeles.
Hans, years ago, you could get a map that was popular, a popular fan and tourist thing, put out in the 1940s by Hollywood. And what it did was it showed the state of California, but it showed all the places that represented different countries in Hollywood films. Like if you'd come up to the San Bernardino Mountains, and that was Germany, Austria, or Switzerland.
Oh,
you
wow.
go to the deserts, and that was Arabia or wherever. And it was showing you all the places you can find in California that double for other parts of the fill in for other parts of the world. So that's kind of an interesting little reason why, one of the reasons why the filmmakers that were all back in New Jersey and New York flocked to California.
That makes, a lot of sense. And even today, when you watch TV shows and movies, you can instantly recognize, oh, that's the back lot at Universal Studios, which is being used in a lot of Star Trek, and other films. And then the back hills behind MASH. I mean, God, how many movies and films of?
Yeah, that's the Fox Ranch where
right.
So many films and TV shows. One of my favorite stories is connected with a film that fits in this discussion, the original Gunga Din.
Oh, wow. Okay.
70 years later, or whenever it was. Oh, my gosh. The son of the adventure actor, Mary Pickford's husband. Gosh darn it. Anyway, so-and-so Jr., who was in Gunga Din, I cannot believe I'm forgetting the name right now, dropping the name. But he was at a screening of Gunga Din, and there was a gentleman from India who was insisting that he goes, oh, I know where you filmed that. That's near where, I live. And Douglas Fairbanks Jr., came to me. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. said, no, sir, we filmed that in California in a place called Lone Pine. And he said, no, you cannot fool me. I know my country. That's in the hills of blah, blah, blah. But it was filmed in the Alabama hills in Lone Pine, California. And it really does look like, like it absolutely could have been in India. But
there are so many trophic areas in the United States that could easily double for other areas of the world because they're in the same, longitude and latitudinal spaces. And so there's a lot of the same terrain around the world that looks very similar. Spoilers alert, Lost Horizon's an interesting story. It's about a British politician and a bunch of other characters. They're fleeing somewhere, I believe, in Afghanistan or Pakistan. And instead of going west, the direction they're supposed to go, or east, the direction they were trying to go back to Shanghai, they end up going west, and they end up crash landing somewhere in the Himalayas or somewhere in the Kush range, or as we call it, the Zaskar and Xizang mountains, just north of Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan areas. And they're met by a group of people that come from this sacred and hidden valley of Shangri-La. They're completely isolated, and they start to realize that the longer that they're there, the more of a longevity of life that they start having. And so there's like the secret behind the story. And then eventually the main character, Conway, leaves, thinking that someday he might come back and try and find this space. And so I thought it was a very fascinating story. I'd actually like to read the book, but watching both versions of the movie really opened my mind to this, because I had never heard of it. So thank you for introducing me to this movie. And so we get into the 1973 version of this movie, and it's interesting that this building looks like something that you would find in Kathmandu. This almost looks like the Yak and Yeti Hotel, which is downtown Kathmandu. But this was actually filmed at Mount Tabor Lodge here in Oregon, up at Mount Hood. And I find that, not Mount Tabor Lodge, Timberline Lodge. Sorry, Mount Tabor is actually near where I live. But yeah, Timberline Lodge. And so it's like, wow, how much, facade and construction did they actually do? Well, having been on a film set, I was actually on the film set of Little Buddha when they filmed that in Nepal with Keanu Reeves and Chris Isaacs and Bridget Fonda and a couple of other, there's a young boy in the movie, but they filmed part of this movie in Kathmandu. And so I got to hang out with Keanu Reeves back in the day for about a month. It was 1992 when they were filming this. But they built this entire beautiful city at the old city of Bhaktapur, which sadly a lot of it was destroyed in the 2015 earthquake. But I was so impressed at how much of what I was seeing in that film was not there. It was all completely constructed just for the movie. And so it was really fascinating to see how this all worked out. But this version of Lost Horizon, as we said, was a musical. I didn't realize it was a musical. So there's a lot of song and dance in it. And it tells basically the same story from a more modern perspective. But the fact that a lot of this was filmed in Oregon and around Mount Hood is interesting, because around the same time was when Stanley Kubrick was filming The Shining. And so there could be a possibility of similar sets being used across the board.
Well, actually, The Shining was filmed some years later.
Yeah.
Remember, it was released in... Oh, are you saying the same place or at the same
time?
No,
it was filmed in the same place. Yeah, a lot of it was filmed...
place. Okay.
The exterior shots were all filmed at Timberline Lodge at Mount Hood.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's always been fascinating, because it's like, why did Timberline Lodge become this amazing place to start filming things? Obviously we had Harry Truman go up there and commission it as this amazing site, because when you're at Mount Hood and you're at Timberline Lodge and you ride the gondola up to the first ski spot, you have, on a clear day, the most commanding view all the way up to Canada, all the volcanic mountains that direction, and all the way down to Shasta. I mean, you can see every single one of them in a row. And so Timberline Lodge literally has one of the most commanding views of any place I've been in Oregon, period. So yeah, anyway, but then it gets into other movies. And so in 1986, we have The Golden Child. And so this Buddhist monk, this Tulku reincarnate, comes out of this hidden city way up in the Himalayas that could be considered as Shangri-La of sorts, because this child possesses this divine power, this out-of-body power. And The Golden Child is an amazing movie. If anybody in the crowd has seen it, it really is a great movie. We then go into strangely. Sorry, what?
I just want to add that I'm glad you brought up Golden Child, because there's a sequence in there that could be right out of Talbot Mundy's Cave of Terrors, which I have talked about here on the show before.
How interesting.
And that's when Eddie Murphy's got to go through the various challenges.
I got the knife.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there, because my viewers here, they know all about me talking about Talbot Mundy. So
if I'm trying to remember that scene correctly, he's given a glass of water and he's told you cannot spill a drop of the water, but you have to solve these 3 different challenges. And one of them is going across, like going through a fire pit or something, or a pit of knives. And the last one is he has to cross this ravine on the top of all these cut trees, basically. And he realizes, that in order to get across this and not spill the glass of water, spoiler alert, he has to drink the water. God, I would not want to drink the water coming out of this village in Nepal. But he drinks the water, and that actually gives him access to the knife. And it's interesting because the knife is a parbu. And this is the same knife that's used in a later film, The Shadow. And so I find it very interesting that this knife and this concept of Shambala or Shangri-La comes up in The Golden Child of all movies. And so then we get into, strangely, G.I. Joe, the animated movie. And in this, G.I. Joe meets the origin of Cobra, which comes from this place called Cobra-La or Shangri-La in the middle of the Himalayas. And it's interesting that Cobra-La is ruled by a Naga, which is a mythical creature that comes out of Hindu and Buddhist belief that basically has the body of a serpent and the torso of a human, which is fascinating because also in The Golden Child, they meet one of the elders who's hidden behind a screen who tells him the future and what he needs to do as the chosen one, basically. And she is also a Naga. She has the body of a serpent and the torso of a human. And so this concept flows over into G.I. Joe, the movie. Another movie which most people have never seen, it's probably Mia Jojovich's first movie. She was about 16 in this movie. And it's called Night Train to Kathmandu, which is super ironic because there are no trains that go into Nepal, especially not up to 4,700 feet where Kathmandu is located. So just the name alone is interesting, but it's about this young prince that comes out of this hidden valley in Nepal, and he falls in love with this young Western girl. And then there's this other gentleman who's trying to steal his talisman so he can find the riches, treasures, and long life prosperity of this hidden city of Shambala. And so toward the end of the movie, the young man takes Mia Jojovich's character up into the mountains, and he uses his talisman to open up the valley and uncover this hidden city, which is fascinating because we find this idea of a hidden city, and you, I think, talked about this before, in the movie The Shadow. And so the same thing, you know, these Tulku monks hide, they mask their existence to the clouded mind, you know, the rest of us in the world. And what's fascinating about the clouded mind is that in Nepalese culture, Westerners were called Quire. Quire means cloudy or white, you know, and so or dense cloud or fog. And so it's interesting that this concept, slightly racist, rolls over into this concept that they can cloud our vision and hide their reality from us. And so I also found it interesting that the main orifice of this city is this giant serpent. And so here we have this Naga representation as well, but we also have Parba, this knife that was also used in The Golden Child as something that would defeat demons and defeat the enemies. And so another movie with a Shambhala or Shangri-La reference. And also one that kind of follows even though it's a color movie, it has this sort of film noir aspect, very similar to Lost Horizon. We then get into 7 Years in Tibet, where, you know, Heinrich Herr basically thinks Tibet as a Shangri-La or Shambhala, you know, kind of state in a sense. He goes there to find himself and does, and it's an incredibly beautiful movie. If you've never seen 7 Years in Tibet,
that's one of my favorites. I was looking for. I have a replica of the Purba from The Shadow.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Guess where I got it of all places?
eBay. No, just kidding.
I got it in Afghanistan.
Oh, are you serious? All right. Oh,
and
excellent.
It's heavy steel, and it's sharp it's dangerous sharp. And we've moved some things around in the house, and now I don't know where it's at immediately at the moment. But if I think of it, I'll bring it out. It's I mean, the triple blade is like that long, and you know, but it's a replica of the one from The Shadow that you mentioned.
Unfortunately, I can't see you because I've got full screen going, so I don't even know if I'm on screen. But as long as you guys are seeing what I'm showing here. 7 Years in Tibet is also a very interesting reference because this is a direct reference to Madame Blavatsky. She spent 7 years in Tibet and wrote about it as 7 Years in Tibet. And so having Herr kind of follow in that theosophist aspect of going into Tibet and spending that time there, I find that very interesting that we have this crossover between the two. Another great movie, which reminded me a lot of what we were talking about with Lost Horizon, is Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. It's very film noir. It has these newsflash, this is happening in the world, and this is happening in the world, which we get kind of in the middle of Lost Horizon as well. but they crash land in this area and are rescued again by people from Shambhala or Shangri-La before they embark on the rest of their journey. And so there is this interesting crossover with Lost Horizon, with the plane crashing and being rescued by people from this, this hidden valley of beauty. So great movie as well, Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow, if any of you have ever seen it. Then we get into Batman Begins, and he's told while he's in jail by the protagonist, basically, that if you pick a certain blue lotus and follow the trails up into the mountains, you will find a hidden monastery. Well, you will learn, the ways of your future. And so this hidden monastery is also considered this Shangri-La, Shambhala aspect, where Batman, Bruce Wayne, learns the tricks of his trades. He becomes a ninja, and he essentially becomes one of the Brotherhood in a sense. And so, the League of Shadows, they call themselves. And so I found that whole aspect of Batman Begins also very interesting and telling, that we have, again, this story of Shangri-La and Shambhala showing up in these amazing modern movies, just hidden in plain sight. Another great movie is the third Mummy installment, The Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, where once things are released, they're entered into this sacred city of Shambhala or Shangri-La, where they meet, the Monkey King, the Dragon Emperor, in a sense. And so, again, why do these concepts keep coming back up? There's some interesting aspect there. And then back to G.I. Joe and G.I. Joe Retaliation, they have to, I wouldn't say rescue, but they kidnap Storm Shadow, basically, from this Shambhala, Shangri-La retreat high up in the Himalayas, where they are healing him through medicinal and Buddhist practice. And so, again, G.I. Joe, interesting that they keep having this concept come back and forth. Lastly, we have Doctor Strange. I don't think this is lastly. I think there's another one. But Doctor Strange is interesting because here we have Khemitology. And so back to you, Walter, with this word Kham. So Khemitology is a city hidden in plain sight within the Kathmandu Valley. And a lot of this was filmed at Patan Doka, which is one of the old Durbars, one of the old kingdoms of Kathmandu. But a lot of it was also filmed at my friend's hotel, the Vajra Hotel. Some of the porch scenes were all filmed there. And the Vajra Hotel, a friend of mine designed it after these old, Newari Patalas, which is what we're looking at here. But it's interesting that Khemitology, as a Shangri-La or Shambhala aspect, comes up in the Doctor Strange movies. And I find it interesting that it has this relation to the Kham Empire and the Kham people as well, through its name, Khemitology. And so, what is Shangri-La? It's interesting that in eastern Kham Tibet, we have this 1.2 kilometer long monastery that is known as the Shangri-La Monastery. And so Eastern Kham Tibet is now considered central China. It's fascinating that also in this region are these incredibly odd star fort towers. I've been looking high and low. There's about 20 of these in this valley of Xibu or Xiba, which is also in Kham Tibet. It's a little closer to Tibet than the Shangri-La Monastery, which is interesting. But I've been trying to find either a topographical map looking down at them or something from satellite. I went on Google Earth and I couldn't find anything. But I want to see if these star forts have a specific stellar alignment that they're mimicking in the sky. Otherwise, they're located strategically in this valley, and the question is, what are they there for? Are they there to see if marauders are coming up the valley? Obviously, you would have lookouts much further down the valley. You would use smoke signals or fire signals to alert people in the upper valley. But it's interesting that there's about 20 of these towers in this valley, and nobody really knows what they're used for or why they're all designed in this 8-pointed star configuration. You see this also in ancient Chinese art, a depiction of this valley. So these are the towers from an ancient time. I'm not really sure how old this painting is, but it is actually a historical painting of this valley. And so here you see the different towers being depicted in this old Chinese art depiction, which kind of gets into my own studies. I've been to Bhutan, and I feel that Bhutan, to me, is a Shangri-La. It is a Shambhala. You are very hard-pressed to even get into Bhutan. you have to be invited. And so basically you send in your visa, permit subscription in a sense. You're reviewed. They might invite you, they might not. They only allow 2,000 tourists, at least when I was there in 1998 doing my thesis. They allow 2,000 tourists a year. It's anywhere from $300 to $600 a day, not including ground transportation or room and board. So that's all extra. And they only allow you 10 days, and you're only allowed to go from Paro, which is around the corner from, this is called the Tiger's Nest Monastery. When I was there, it was burnt to the ground, so I actually never got to go into this monastery, but they rebuilt it. And so the Paro Valley is just beyond it. And then you drive past Tiger's Nest into Thimphu, and then 12 hours from Thimphu is Bumtong, and that's as far as they let you go. But because my father worked in Bhutan for 7 years during the late 90s, early 2000s, he worked at the Institute of Forestry in far eastern Trashigang, Bhutan. I was granted a 2-month visa for special access to a lot of the Lakongs and Zongs, which are the monasteries, so I could study Buddhist culture, mysticism, ascended Tulku masters, the art and architecture of Bhutan. And so I feel incredibly fortunate that I was able to see a lot of Bhutan that most people don't get to see. And so for me, Bhutan is a Shangri-La. It is one of these old, untouched countries by the Western world. And they want to preserve that and keep it that way, which is incredibly fascinating because it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. And the people there have the largest hearts and are just smiley and receptive, and they love everything and everybody that they see. And this is hard pressed in our world of conflict and division. So like I say, Bhutan to me was a Shangri-La. But there are other areas like the Altai Mountains, which border Mongolia, Tibet, and Siberia, that are just these beautiful places that are so untouched by human hand. But then you find these civilizations in the middle of them, and you're like, wow, where did this civilization come from? And so it's interesting to look at shaman practices across the region, because you have in the upper left the Nepalese shaman, in the upper right you have the Altai Mongolian shaman, in the lower left you have the Taltos shaman from Romania, and that whole area around the Black Sea. And interestingly, the Taltos shaman are very much related to the Nepalese shaman, which, as you see here, are also very related to the Altai shaman and even the Tibetan shaman. And they all use very similar, artifacts. So they have their drum that's, made from the animal skins. They have their bells. They have so many different artifacts that are used in the same way. Feathers, dreadlocks, the whole 9 yards. And so I've always found it interesting that there's this cross culture across this region, but we even find this with Native American shamans. And so the question is, are all of these, shamanic groups related? And what would they be related to? Well, getting back to the whole aspect of Shambala and Shangri-La, I've always been fascinated with Mount Shasta, not Mount Shasta. Well, I'm fascinated with Mount Shasta, and I'll be there actually next Friday speaking. And its connection to the underworld as well, because obviously, as we know, the lava tubes there go into the underworld and possibly go into a version of Shambhala or the inner earth. But also, I've been very fascinated with Mount Meru. And so Mount Meru is a very physical mountain. As I said, it exists on the northwest corner of Tibet near Ladakh. But it's also considered, and this is basically what Mount Meru looks like in depictions. It's also considered the 7 chakra points of the world, which stem from Shambhala all the way deep in the earth, all the way to the crown chakra, which connects to the heavens and is said to connect by a rainbow bridge to the brightest star that rises in the east, the star of Sirius. And so on the right here, we have a depiction of the Milky Way as this beautiful rainbow that stretches from the top of the Himalayas all the way to the horizon. And so is there a correlation between the Milky Way and this rainbow bridge that connects this dimensional portal of Mount Meru and physical mountain of Mount Meru to Sirius? And so here's a better depiction of this in more of a mandala form, showing all 7 of the different layers stemming from the inner earth of Shambhala all the way to the crown chakra that connects to the skies. And so this is kind of the end of my presentation here. Let's see if I can actually get out of this. There we are. So yeah, that brings me back around to what we've been talking about with Shambhala and Shangri-La, and why is it such a fascinating place, and why has it gained such attention through Hollywood and through other medium? You're on mute.
This
Bingo.
is okay. You weren't able to see before.
No, so you have your Prabha, yeah.
But
oh wow! What? Oh my God, that's amazing.
And this thing's heavy. This is made out of steel, and like I said, when I display it, it's got to be somewhere out of the reach of any kids that might visit, or anyone who gets angry, right? Because it's deadly. And I got it in Kabul, Afghanistan.
Wow.
Now that they probably ordered it from the Franklin catalog or something.
No, I'm not sure about that, because quite honestly, when you're in Nepal, there you will find Prabha like that look. They're exactly like this. So you have a demon on one side and an angelic being on the other. Yeah, and this is literally how they're all portrayed. But in the movies, obviously, they animated it and made it into a living being.
Imagine, Hans, if I have a real Prabha, and I assumed it was a replica from the film.
Who knows?
All these years, if I know the right words, this thing will jump up and start flying across the room at me.
Well, you never know. you might need to be initiated by a special Tolku master of sorts. So.
Yeah. Now, I did bring something home from Afghanistan. It was this beautiful picture rug, which I'm sure you've seen. They make them for the tourist trade.
Is it more of a Persian style rug, or
it's
intricate knotwork?
It's. I don't think it's that intricate or traditional in that sense. I think it might. I'm going to assume it's something done for tourists. But it was the farther you get away from it, of course, the more it
detail,
comes in focus. And it was an image of a woman, an Afghan woman with the veil on, and she was holding a teapot. And this thing was big. It was like 3 feet by 5 feet. And I had it hanging on my bedroom wall in a house I was living in out in Rancho Mirage. And we had some paranormal stuff going on in the house. And we had an exorcist, but an interesting exorcist, a Japanese Shinto exorcist.
Oh, wow. How did that go down?
Well, he was an in-law to my then girlfriend who I was living with. And he came into the house, and that was one of the 2 items that he said to get rid of. He said that there was a spirit attached to that rug, and that's what was causing the problem.
Uh-oh. Did I lose you? I think you cut out there, Tim. Walter, come back. Well, while he's gone, yeah, I also picked up some artifacts in South Asia. So this is the Vajra Dorje. Very interesting. It's hard to find these. Usually you find the ones that have 2 lightning bolts. Oh, you're back.
I don't know what the hell that was.
It's the heat, man. It's like you down there. We've had 4 days of 100+ degree weather here in Oregon. And even though I have air conditioning in my office right now, it's about 110 degrees. So we start sweating.
What was I saying when it cut me off?
The exorcism in the house, and you were trying to remove items.
Yeah, we took this rug down from the wall, folded it up, put it into a big duffel bag that I had dragged all the way from Afghanistan home in, and put it in the garage until we figured out what we were going to do with it. Now the garage. The back wall of the garage was the wall where the headboard of the bed was in the master bedroom. I kid you not, we're laying there one night, the first night, and we hear a distinct
oh wow
coming from inside that friggin' garage. Wow. And that garage door was locked. There was no one out. I mean, just hey assholes, I'm still out here. And so anyway, that
interesting that's kind of like not similar, but similar to the scene in Indiana Jones, where they lock up the Ark of the Covenant in the boat belly to transport it back to Germany, and it just eats away the whole case that it's sitting in because it doesn't want to be there.
Well, I'm glad that he checked this out too. He didn't find any bad spirits in this, so
could be newer, but it's interesting that it's made. You said it's made from steel, right? Or iron.
Yeah, believe me, this is steel, and this is not light. I'm terrible at guessing but this has got to be at least like 3 pounds, maybe 4. If I had a scale, I could put it in there. This thing's heavy. This could be used. This is weapon quality.
Oh yeah. Oh, easily.
So
don't mess with me, or
so now let's jump over to the Khemitology part.
Yes. Okay.
Your Egyptian travels, and what I found an interesting connection is that you talked about those 4 items that were in that box that were brought down. This is very similar to the legend and lore of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who brought 4 treasures down, to Ireland when they came down, but also between the wheel of Hecate and the Dambala wheel, right? The Dharma wheel. I'm sorry.
There's the Dharma chakra and the Kama chakra.
Yeah, Dambala's voodoo, so that's a different wheel. But the Dharma wheel, I find, okay, there's Hecate. There's the Hecate connection. And Hecate, of course, totally associated with Egyptian magic and mysticism and Khemitology. But go into your experience with Egypt and Khemitology studies.
God, I have another. We can get into another slideshow here because I'm actually doing a workshop on this in Shasta on Friday, next Friday at 1:30. Khemitology was brought to me by my good friend Stephen Mailer, Patricia Iowan Lehman, and Yusuf Iowan. And Yusuf was the son of Hakim, who, if anybody in the crowd has seen the Pyramid Code, it's an amazing 4-part documentary series. Hakim was an indigenous wisdom keeper. He had knowledge passed down to him through the Iwan, or the I tribe, which comes out of the ancient Suf religions that predated anything that the Greeks ever came up with around ancient Egypt. So most of the history of Egypt that we have comes from the Greeks. And so the Greeks applied a lot of their own history to what they saw with the Egyptian history. And so when they conquered Egypt around 320 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and then the Ptolemaic period came in. Ptolemaic is interesting because Ptolemy was a title. It wasn't a name. Ptolemy comes from Ptah, which was a Greek or a Egyptian or Kemetian god of creation, was the god Ptah. And so when the Greeks showed up in what is the city now known as Memphis, basically, but Memphis was called Men-Akir or Men-Kir. Let me get into the slideshow here because this will make a little bit more sense. Oh, am I still sharing? I guess I am. Weird. Let me stop sharing this and present this. I'm just going to use my screen so I can actually see what's going on here. So I'm sharing now, so I don't know if it's popping up. Okay. So Egypt and Atlantic Kemet, Alternative History and Mysteries by myself. These are the people that helped me understand a lot about Khemitology, even though I kind of disagree with some of the approaches of it, and I have my own interpretations of it. I'm giving credit where credit is due. Stephen Mailer and Yusuf Mailer were the ones that brought me the idea of Khemitology, along with Patricia Iowan Lehman. And they all learned from indigenous wisdom keeper Abdel Hakim Iowan. Basically, what is Kemet? Kemet comes from Kemt. The ancients didn't use a lot of vowels in their words, except when speaking. So when they would present things, it would be non vowel based. So Kemt or Kemet comes from this Egyptian or Kemetian hieroglyph, which basically shows the irrigation wall. The owl represents darkness. The dome of the sky represents Nut. And the place of origin is the circle with the X through it, which is interesting because this has many different references over the course of time in symbology. But this combined hieroglyph basically means the black fertile land. Not sure if we lost you again there, Walter, but I'll keep going. Anyway, this is where we get the words from alchemy, chemistry, chemical, chemo, and basically I have chemistry in there twice, but this all comes from the alchemical concepts. And what's interesting is, where do we get Egyptology from? Well, Egyptology comes from Jean-François Champollion, who basically founded the scientific Egyptology connection and played a major role in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs from the Rosetta Stone. However, the glyphs on the Rosetta Stone, if you've ever noticed, are incomplete. And so the question is, how much of it did he really translate? And therefore, how much of it is actually decipherable? Ah, you're back. Here we go. Egyptologists study the Greek-inspired history of the land, which much of it is incomplete and incorrect because, as you see here with the Rosetta Stone is broken. And so we don't have the full picture of what was actually going on with the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And as we know, they don't align to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or any of the Latin vowels or consonants. They have their own pictographic form, which represents a certain concept. But then when you combine these pictographs together, they represent another concept. And so I'm very skeptical at Champollion's actual translation of the Rosetta Stone. So this gets into what we were talking about briefly before you disappeared there, Walter. This is the notion of Ptah. And so when the Greeks showed up in Memphis, or Menkaure, which means the city of fertility in a sense, because we'll get into that in the different translations. They were told by seeing a stele in the middle of the city at a temple that the stele said Het Ka Ptah. So this is in the Suf or ancient Khemitology language. And Het Ka Ptah means the enclosure. Het Ka, or Het, is an enclosure. Ka is your body, or a second physical form of your body. And Ptah is the creator god. And so Het Ka Ptah means the enclosure or temple for the body of the creator. So this is a temple. This is a place of worship. But the Greeks thought that this was a representation of the entire land, and they heard Hepkaptos. And so Hepkaptos is where we get the origins of the Coptic word, or Coptic. Koptos comes from this. And it still means the origin, the place or body of the son of the creator. This is the temple. But then the Greeks translated that, or through transliteration, heard Egyptos. And so Egyptos then became Egypt. And it's interesting because Jesus comes out of this Coptic tradition as well. The Coptic Christians existed long before Jesus ever existed in the Bible. And so it's interesting because Jesus is known as Yeshua, or Jesus. And so this also means the body or son of the creator, where Christos is a title. It means the anointed one. So Jesus Christ means the anointed son of the creator, which is kind of a direct translation or transliteration in a sense of Het Ka Ptah. But Ptolemaic period comes from Ptah. It's not somebody's name out of Greek philosophy. It's actually a title from ancient Khemitology times. And so we get into some of the Greek names. And it's interesting because most of what we know of Egypt are all Greek names. So the city of Tanis was actually originally the city of Genet, which meant the fertile garden oasis, because where Tanis is located is near the Mediterranean Sea. And so this would have been a very fertile Nile Delta city, basically, hence the fertile garden oasis. Heliopolis was the city of On, or Un, which was the city of the wise sun. Heliopolis also means the city of the sun in Greek. Memphis was Min Nefer, which means fertile harmony. Min was the Nefer or Neter, the aspect of nature that represented fertility, and Nefer always means harmony. We have Ramses or Ramses, which was Ram Masu, which means the rebirth of Ra, the sun, Ra Masu. We have Osiris, which was initially Wasir, or the wise, or where we get the word wizard from, but this is also where we get the word Osiris from. And so the land of Osiris would be known as Bu Wasir, or Bu Wasiris. So his consort was Isis. Well, her name was Aset. And As means water, and so Aset means the water of life. where Anubis, the god of the underworld, was Anu or Anupa. And this became known as the decaying sun, or the sun that goes into hiding, because this is where Anubis comes into play. And so there are other words that are misinterpreted as well, like Hor from Horus means the male aspect of the house. Hathor was the female aspect of the house, but the Greeks thought these were gods and goddesses, and so this is how they named them in their pantheon. The city of Aswan means, As means water, and Suan means of the south, and so where Aswan is located is the southern waters of the Nile, before you get into Nubia and into Ethiopia, where the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet. And so it's interesting that Aswan is this word that kind of is misinterpreted. Asgat Nefer. Asgat means the harmony of water. And it's always depicted as this foot with a jug of water spilling over it. And so it's a recycling process of clean, harmonic water, similar to what we would call today structured water, or water that's drinkable and has beneficial properties to it. Unas is a pyramid. It's actually the only pyramid in all of the ancient Egypt and Khemitology pyramids that has scriptures inside of it. And the scriptures inside of it are known as the Pyramid Code. And the Pyramid Code basically describes some interesting aspects, and some of it deals with the exodus from Atlantis, or the time of Atlantis. And so Unas means the wise sun that meets the water. And it's interesting because in front of the Unas pyramid in Saqqara is a huge lake, or man-made lake. And so it would be a reflecting pool, similar to what we see in Washington, D.C. with the giant obelisk there, the Washington Monument. You have this amazing reflecting pool. Horus comes from Hor. This also represents the rising sun and the setting sun. And so for 80 years, Horus fights his uncle Set, or Seth. And so you have sunrise and sunset that comes out of this whole aspect of Horus. But the one that's the most misinterpreted is Amun-Ra. And so we're told through the Greeks that Amun-Ra meant the sun. But actually, it's two phases of the sun. Amun is the hidden sun, and Ra is the adolescent sun. And so it's the hidden power of the sun is what this word basically translates to. And even more fascinating, getting into some extraterrestrial aspects of ancient Egypt, in the Khemitology Phoenician connections, we have a direct connection to Mars. So Cairo, in both Suf and Arabic language, is Al-Qahira, which means the vanquisher, the warrior, or the city of Mars. And so it's interesting that the lands of Phoenicia stretched across from basically Lebanon and Syria all the way around the Mediterranean. And this whole area was known as Cydonia. And it's literally located close to or on the 33rd degree north parallel, which is interesting because there's some connection to this parallel with Walt Disney World, as well as San Diego. This all falls within that parallel as well as many other cities around the world, like Baghdad is on this, Cairo is on this, New Delhi is on this. I mean, there's so many cities around the world that fall on this parallel. And so this is also where we find pyramids, and things that are replicating the belt stars of Orion, and the Sphinx, which mirrors Leo or possibly Anubis. We'll get into that. But on Mars, interestingly, when they started doing the Viking surveillance in the 1970s, and then when we went back with the Mars Observatory satellite and started taking photos of this area, along the same parallel, they decided to name this area around the 33rd degree parallel Cydonia, and called it the city on Mars, because you find all these very interesting pyramidical structures, the five-sided DMM pyramid and all these other pyramids that are there, as well as what we think of as remnants of an ancient civilization. And the face on Mars is there as well. And so there's an interesting connection between these two sites on Earth, Cydonia dealing with the Phoenicians, and Cydonia today dealing with NASA's connections. And if you look at how these structures supposedly are laid out in Cydonia on Mars, they represent the constellation of the Pleiades. And so this has been an interesting connection as well in discovering some of this. But then we get into the 5 phases of the sun, and this is why this is. I think I'm frozen up here. What's going on? Hello. Maybe I need to be on a screen. Okay, there we go. So the 5 phases of the sun from the Khemitology cosmology come down to, as I say, the 5 phases. So the first phase is called Sahra. We know this is Kepher, the rising sun. So Kepher is the dung beetle or the scarab. It pushes a ball of dung with its larva inside of it up to the top of a sand dune in the early morning so that the sun will heat it and give birth to the larva, but then they have something to eat from. And so this is why the Kepher is known as the digger, but is also, once it flies, is a representation of Horus. And so this is where we get the phrase Horus on the horizon or the horizon. But it's also where we get the name or the title of Sarah or Sarah, which means the birth of the sun. Sahra. And so the second phase of the sun is called Ra, and this is the adolescent or angry sun. And basically this is, early morning to noon. It's always depicted as the circle within the circle and has the rays shining out from it. You'll see an amazing depiction of this whenever you see stele or glyphs dealing with Akhenaten. He's always depicted with the sun ray behind him and the rays shining down beneath him, but they all have hands connected to them. And so it's fascinating that this is why, the Greeks attributed the sun to Ra. But Ra is only one phase of the sun. It's the angry sun. But this is where we get rays of the sun from Ra, or Israel, the sun god over water, is what Israel actually kind of translates to. And so when you get into the noon aspect or the afternoon aspect, you have Un as the wise sun, and it's just the circle with the inner sun. And we get the words noon or afternoon from this, and even the word to turn on. And so On or Un was the name of Heliopolis, which the Greeks basically called the city of On. But Heliopolis to the Greeks also meant the city of the sun. In the late afternoon, that sunset session for you surfers, skateboarders, and mountain bikers out there is like the best time to go out and, hit the waves or hit the planks or hit the trails. And you're getting that sunset. It's beautiful light. And so this is known as Aten, the wisest sun, or the sun of enlightenment. And we get Aten becomes attention or presence or harmony, because that's what this phase of the sun represents. And the 5th phase of the sun is Amun, the veil of darkness, the hidden or westing. And so in the Khemitologian philosophy, we do not die. We follow the track of the sun into the west, where we west, only to be reborn again. And so this shows up in Star Wars, going back to quoting movie references, where you have Luke Skywalker. And so Luke is known as Lucius. Lucius is another name for the sun. And so Luke, or the sun, walks the sky, where on the horizon, he meets his dark father, Darth Vader, Darth Father, right? And he fights his Darth Father through the darkness, only to vanquish him to become light again. And so this is the cycle of the sun. And this is literally the story of Luke Skywalker. And so in the first Star Wars movie, he's wearing white. He's the morning sun. In the second story, he becomes Ra and then becomes Un. He's angry and he's trying to battle his own, fears. And then he meets his dark father, who cuts his hand off. Spoiler alert, of course, if you've never seen Star Wars, I'm sorry. And then in Return of the Jedi, he's wearing black because he realizes in order to fight his father, he has to replicate his father. He has to become his father to fight his father and vanquish him, because he still finds love and light within him. And so it's such an interesting story that goes over so many people's heads, because we're all bedazzled by, the space mythology and the space opera of it all, that we miss the esoteric knowledge. Yeah. So spiritual names of 2 kings. Amenhotep IV is known as the veil of the hidden altar. Amun is the hidden veil, basically. And Hotep is an altar. Well, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten. And Akhenaten, Ankh or Akhenaten, becomes the light body and the key of enlightenment. So he goes from being the hidden altar to the key of light, right? And this is why he changed pretty much the religious pantheon from the netters, the aspects of nature, all these gods and goddesses, to a singular god, a monotheism, the god of the sun. The sun gives us all of our life. Everything that we need comes from the sun. And so his son's name was Tut-Ankh-Amen, which becomes the completed hidden key of life, because the Ankh is the key of life. And interestingly, his main, not mentor, but the person that worked mostly under Akhenaten was known as Pa-Ren-Nefer. Well, Pa-Ren-Nefer means the harmony of secret names. And it's interesting because this is the character that we think of that shows up later on as Moses. But Moses was never known as Moses. I always thought it came from Tut-Moses, but it doesn't. It actually comes from Ramasu, Ramses. So Ramses, or Ramasu the first, was Moses. And so this is the rebirth of Ra. Again, the rebirth of the monotheist. And so Moses was considered the second historical monotheist. And so this kind of comes out of this spiritual aspect of these two kings. So then there's the 9 souls of the afterlife, or Westing. There's Ket, the physical body, Saha, the spiritual body, Ren, the secret name or the identity. So when you die, or when you West, your body is considered like a Russian doll. It has multiple layers, different from karma or chakra points. This is more like a nesting scenario. And so each phase of your West or your death, you shed another phase of who you are. And so Ket, Sa, Ren, these are all different phases of who you are before you eventually cross the duat and either reincarnate or enlighten yourself. So after Ren is Ba. Ba is the personality or the spirit. It's depicted as a bird with your head on it. If you've ever seen the movie Spirited Away, which is a great movie, Baba Yaga, the main head of the bathing house that is where most of the movie takes place, she disappears into the night, where she will fold herself up into a crow or a bird with her head on it and fly off into the east, basically, or into the west, sorry, to rule the night, but then comes back in the morning and becomes Baba Ren or Baba Yaga again. But she is a Ba in Spirited Away. Great movie if you've ever seen it. Then we have Ka, the double, right? And so Ka represents your virtual double. A great example of this is if you're astral projecting or you have a near-death experience, you will leave your physical body and you will be hovering at the top of the room looking down on yourself asleep in the couch or in the chair on your bed. Well, you're in physical mental form, even though you're in astral projection, but your double is what's laying there in the bed. And so that is your Ka. Then you have your Ib, which is your heart, your Shut, which is your shadow, and eventually your Sakem, which is the power or energy form. And if you can complete all of these elements after weighing your heart, to make sure that you're a pure human in a sense, then you either reincarnate to go through this karmic cycle all again, or you become Aken, the light body. So these are the 9 phases of the afterlife or the soul. And the last thing I guess we'll talk about are the 5 sacred houses, because this is probably one of the most important aspects of Khemitology that Egyptology completely overlooks. The 5th house is called Per-Wer. As we described earlier, Wer means the wiser. Wizir comes from this as well. This is where Osiris comes from. A house, or the sacred house, is always shown as the broken box, so there's an entrance to a structure. And underneath that is always represented the hieroglyph, or in a sense. So Per-Wer is either an old man or a man with a staff. It means the house of the wise, which is usually a university, a library, or a hospital. The 4th sacred house is called Per-Neter, and it's described with the flag or the axe on a stick. And the Per-Neter is the house of nature, or the house of energy of nature. And this is what the ancient Kemetians called the pyramids. They were not tombs. They were houses of nature or energies of nature. And what's interesting about that is the Greeks knew this too, because they called them pyramids, pyramidos, the fire in the middle. Well, why would you have a fire in the middle of a tomb? And if you get into Christopher Dunn's work, I know Dark Journalist has talked about this a lot as well, as has Joseph Farrell. There's an idea that the netters or the per-netters, the pyramids, were not just energy creation sites, but could also be used as directed energy sites. And I've
also in my esoteric Napoleon book, I present my hypothesis.
That's correct, you do. That's right.
That the coffer in the king's chamber is the location of what we would call the Monge point, and the Monge point mathematically is where all the planes of a given particular object, which is pyramids, fall under this category, where all the multiple planes that are there intersect at the Monge point. So therefore, my hypothesis was that that's why Napoleon had his psychometric experience. He was laying in the coffer, and that's what happens to people when they get in there. Their consciousness is tapped into, so-called wired into this Monge point, where all the different planes, of physical reality and metaphysical reality come together.
That's interesting. I was gonna I should show my experience in the Great Pyramid as well, which is somewhere down here.
Yeah, you had mentioned. That's why.
Yeah, when you go into the King's Chamber, it's fascinating because you're in this room. If you go on a regular tour, you pay $200 to $300. They only take you into the King's Chamber. But if you're on a private tour, they'll give you 2 to 3 hours full access to the entire pyramid, except the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber.
Mm-hmm.
And they tell you, because you're in an Islamic nation, you can't chant, you can't do religious practice, you can't have ceremonies, none of this is allowed to happen in there. But the first thing people do when they get into the King's Chamber on these private tours is everybody starts toning. And so the King's Chamber tones to, I believe it's E or it's E or F sharp. I
think it's F sharp.
It's F sharp.
Yeah.
And so everybody starts toning at F sharp, and I do split toning when I tone in there, and you feel the resonance of the room building in your body. It's rather intense. And then everybody takes their rounds and eventually gets into the box. When you're in the box, it tones at A. And so this is like a third and also a fifth harmony of F sharp. And so when you're toning in the box, you're creating this resonance field around you, and everybody else is toning in the room at a different frequency. So weirdly, you're creating a Merkaba energy around you. And you feel like you are in outer space inside of the King's Chamber. You do not feel like the rest of the universe exists around you. You are in this void in space, and especially when you're in the box. And this is why people feel like they're astral projecting out of the box, because once they start toning in the box, these two harmonic frequencies overlap each other and create this resonance point, or as you were saying, this Monge point, which is really fascinating. And so after that experience, I avoid the Queen's Chamber. It's kind of boring. I've been in there twice, but I will go down to the subterranean shaft before anybody else does. I will climb and crawl all the way to the end of the dead end shaft, which is about 30 meters back from the room. It's not a dead end shaft. It's cemented off at the end with a hole drilled through the wall, but they call it the dead end shaft. And I will ground myself down there because you don't hear anything else but yourself. And the noise is so loud in there, it's unbelievable. But you're not physically hearing it. You're feeling it. And it's your own inner noise. And it's like one of the most amazing experiences. Anyway, back to the 5 houses.
Real quick,
yeah, no worries.
That's an interesting description you just gave there, because that sounds like what happens. Wow, that sounds like what happens when you're in a sensory deprivation chamber.
Exactly the same.
Oh, wow, because I have had that experience, and that is mind-blowing.
It's a little different in a sensory deprivation chamber. Obviously, you're floating in 2,000 pounds per square inch of salt.
Yeah.
You don't want to have cuts on your body because it will burn like crazy. And you're in there for 60 to 90 minutes. And I used to do this before I traveled internationally because I don't travel very well. I get jet lag, and I'm not comfortable on planes. And a friend of mine suggested, hey, why don't you do sensory deprivation and go into an isolation chamber before you fly? And so I would do this before, I would go on long international flights. And so you're in the middle of your session, and all of a sudden you do one of these. And you're like, holy shit, how long pardon me, how long have I not been breathing for? Because you come to this realization that you've gone into a state of samadhi, or a state of breathless existence. And so the sensory deprivation is interesting. Also, you don't know what direction you're facing because you feel like you're floating in space. And so, yeah, that is
Right.
a very accurate.
Yeah, what I experienced was, you're laying down in the samadhi tank, of course, and you're horizontal. And after I was in there for however many minutes it takes, suddenly I felt like I was being spun up into a vertical position.
Yes.
And you're right. It's like you're in space. You're just hanging out in blackness and
limbo,
space.
right? Yeah.
And intellectually, and you know in your mind that you're supposed to be lying horizontal, but you're up vertical. And it is startling. It's very, whoa, so. Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
So anyway, back to the 5 houses real quick. So Per Ka is the 3rd house. Per Ka is the house of the body. This is a tomb. This is where people were buried. This is the mastabas. This is the Valley of the Kings and the Queens. This is where all the kings and queens were buried. And I call them kings and queens for a specific reason. Per Ba is the house of the spirit. And so this is a temple. This is a place of worship. And the most important houses, although there are other houses, the most important of the 5 houses is Per Ah. And so it is represented by what they call the mace, but the mace also looks very much like the female reproductive organ. And this is intentional.
It looks like a tie.
Yeah, but it also represents the yoni in a sense.
I get it.
Okay. And this is intentional because Per Ah is considered the high house. It's the house of the woman. And this is where the word pharaoh comes from. There were no male pharaohs ever. Period. End of story. They were all consorts of the high priestesses of Hathor, Hatshepsut, or Isis, which were netters. These were different aspects of nature. They weren't gods and goddesses. And so the priestess would choose her consort, and together they would have a unity project. Here's my tenet. A unity project of the land where the woman ruled over the fertility of the land and the people, and the man ruled over the physicality of the land and the people. And we always see this in the different representations of these, kings and queens, because the queen will always have her arm around her king, as if to say, this is mine. Where in the West, it's completely the opposite, right? Hey, baby, you're mine. Where in ancient, Khemitologian times, this is my unity. This is my unity project. And so this is the Per Ah, the matriarchy of the ancient times. Yes, there were other houses, of course. There's Per Isis, which is the house of Isis. And this is interesting because this is more of a Greek enunciation of the houses. But Per Isis is where we get the word Paris from. So Paris, France, is Per Isis, the house of Isis, or Aset, Per Aset, Per Isis. And we also have Per Ankh, the house of life, because the Ankh represented the key of life, which represents the sacred womb. But interestingly, Yusuf in the city of Tanis, basically, he found this on the wall. Basically, usually this is animated, so you can see the actual glyph. I'll try and move this aside so you can see it. So this is the glyph that he found on the wall. And this is interesting because this represents the place of many houses that you find across 4 waters from the land underneath the sky of Nut, or Tawin, or, ancient Kemet, basically. And so it's called Peru. Well, is there a connection to Peru? And this is very fascinating because in my research, and now Freddie Silva is coming out with a lecture series that even predates my research about how the ancient Khemitans were very much connected to South and Central America. Well, if you're going to cross 4 waters from Egypt to find South America or Peru, even though that's not where the name Peru comes from, it is interesting that this is what you would call the place of many houses. You would cross 4 waters. And so what are those 4 waters? Well, you have the Atlantic, the Nile, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, Amazon. Or if you're going to go all the way around the southern tip of South America, you have the Pacific Ocean, where eventually the trade currents would end you up in Santiago de Chile or even as far north as Paracas, Peru. And so if you were to go the other direction, you would go through the Red Sea, across the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific Ocean. So it's like the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and you would end up at Santiago de Chile and then take the trade currents all the way up to the Amazon or Peru. And so there's an interesting element that there's a possibility that the ancient Khemitans crossed the ocean. Well, do we have evidence of this? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And so what's interesting about that is we have this character from 232 BC named Admiral Maui, which the Polynesians called Maui, and his captain Rata. And so he left in 232 BC, went through the Red Sea, crossed the Indian Ocean, circumnavigated Australia, ended up on the North Island of New Zealand, where the Maoris are, prominent in a sense, and then crossed basically the Pacific, ended up in southern Chile, which all would have been part of the Inca Empire back then, and followed those trade currents all the way up to Peru, possibly across to Easter Island, which we know through the Kon-Tiki Thor Heyerdahl explorations. He basically put off from Paracas in his reed boat, didn't even put up the sails, and ended up at Easter Island. So the trade currents took him directly there. The trade currents from Easter Island would have pushed Maui all the way up to Hawaii. There's a possibility that those trade currents also would have pushed him into the west coast of the United States and Mexico, and all the way up to Alaska. And we see common modalities between the Polynesians, the Hawaiians, the Easter Island people, Native Americans, all the way up the west coast of the Americas, all the way to Alaska. They have very similar totems, very similar carvings, very similar paddles for their seafaring vessels. A lot of this has similarities. And then Maui would have gone back down to the Pitcairn Islands, across through Tonga, and across through Indonesia, and back to ancient Kem, or in this case, Greco-Egypt, because this would have been during the Greco-Egyptian times. Mm-hmm. And how do we know that this was possible? Well, if you actually look at the trade currents, there they are. I mean, not a lot would have needed to have been done to actually cross the oceans during this time, because the trade currents put you into these areas automatically. And so I find it interesting that we have this connection with Maui, or Maui, because the Polynesians, he's considered a god of the ocean. He came out of nowhere, like Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, these characters. Bearded god, comes out of nowhere, unifies the people of Polynesia all the way to Hawaii, Easter Island, Tonga, and Polynesia, including New Zealand, and is in all their lore and legend. And it's interesting that a lot of the red-headed Maori that we find in New Zealand, when they started doing DNA testing on them, because we're told that the Maori didn't exist in New Zealand prior to 800 years ago, but they have spoken verbal lore and legend that goes back 2,000-3,000 years. And so if you start looking at the origin of some of these red-headed, green-eyed Maori, they all come out of this area around Azerbaijan, the Black Sea, Turkey, Armenia, Iran, very similar to the red-headed, elongated skull people of Paracas, Peru, and Nazca, and the Basque people of Spain. They all come out of this region. And so it's interesting that we have this, Egyptian admiral, Maui, going to these areas, coming out of this region as well. And so obviously we knew about some of these elements while history was going on, that we would have traveled there. And as we're told that, the ancients never crossed the seas, well, at the Temple of Hatshepsut, we have a depiction on one of the back walls of one of these large seafaring vessels going across wildlife under the ocean that doesn't exist in the Mediterranean or the Red Sea, but in the Indian Ocean. And so there's evidence in their own hieroglyphs that they had crossed the seas. This is a better depiction of what you see on the wall there. But it's very fascinating that we have this. And around 2000 BC, around the time of King Tut, which is interesting, and Akhenaten, I guess, where is the evidence in South America is the next aspect of this. Well, in Peru, in the Lima Larco Gold Museum, buried in the basement, we have these three headdresses. and they're called Chimu burial headdresses from around 1400 AD. The problem with this is they are very ancient Egyptian or Khemitology. The one in the middle is known as the headdress of Amun, and it's a golden band and two fingers that stick up representing duality. This is very much an ancient Egyptian Khemitology concept, and we find this depiction all over Egypt. But we also find the headdress with different modalities on it. Usually it's solid, like the one in the middle, but oftentimes it's represented with scales or circular items, similar to the two headdresses on the left and right, as we see in the headdress of Amun from 1600 BC or older. And so how could these people have crossed the oceans? Well, I was talking about Kon-Tiki, and so they make similar reed boats on Lake Titicaca today in the upper, Andes around Bolivia. It is in Bolivia, but it also borders Peru, as they did in ancient times on the Nile and the Mediterranean. And so Kon-Tiki, was this amazing voyage. Thor Heyerdahl reproduced one of these boats to see if they actually could travel across the oceans. And he put it off at Paracas around Nazca, went into the ocean, didn't put up his sails, used the trade currents, and ended up at Easter Island. And so we know that they were able to cross the oceans. It's not a mystery.
Yeah, oceans are highways, not barriers.
Correct. And so we find this other controversial item. It was found about 60 to 100 kilometers north of Lake Titicaca. It's known as the Fuente Magna Bowl. It was buried in this farmer's backyard or in his fields. He dug it up. It's about a meter wide or a yard wide. Inside of it are two Proto-Sumerian cuneiform writings. And around the outside of it, I guess I should move this away because you can see around the outside of it, there are depictions of animals that exist in Asia and also in the oceans. And the University of California at Redding transcribed the Proto-Sumerian glyphs basically to say that these were libations to the goddess Nia to request fertility and offer thanks to the bountiful fauna and flora of the area, which made it possible for the Sumerian explorers or Proto-Sumerian explorers to support themselves in Bolivia. This is considered a hoax, but I don't think it is. There also was a stele found in the same area. Sadly, like a lot of these artifacts, it's buried in the basement at the La Paz Museum, never to see the light of day, but it also has these Proto-Sumerian glyphs on it. And so the thought that these ancient Sumerians, Khemitans, Phoenicians were actually crossing the ocean is very plausible. And we also see this, stemming up into other cultures. But around 2500 BC, as I was saying, around the time of King Tut and King Akhenaten, we have what is known as the Gosford glyphs. And so a lot of people called the Gosford glyphs fake. If you get into like Billy Carson's work, there's two sides of a small ravine outside of Gosford, which is a little bit outside of Sydney, that have these hieroglyphic writings on them. They don't match hieroglyphic writings that you find in Egypt. Why? Because the hieroglyphic writings you find in Egypt are like what you would see in a textbook. It's textbook writing versus the commoner's writing. And both sides of this ravine have these hieroglyphic writings. Billy Carson says one side has writings from the Pleiades, but this isn't true. They're all based on ancient Khemitan and Egyptian hieroglyphs. And so the story goes, we've had 3 independent researchers actually go to the Gosford glyphs and research this and write down and translate what's written there. Basically, 2 brothers left Kemet in 2500 BC, traveled through the Red Sea, down through the Indian Ocean, ended up in Australia, circumnavigated Australia, had trades there that went very well, but then something happened on their return trip. There was a storm, and the boat capsized. One of the brothers died. And so the other one made it back to shore around Sydney, and as an homage to his brother, he created this memorial at Gosford. It's interesting that there's supposedly an ancient pyramid at Gosford as well, very old, similar to what you would find in Indonesia at Gunung Padang, kind of more of a smaller scale style pyramid. But he creates this memorial that tells the story of his brother and himself and their trades, and that he wishes his brother, a great life in the afterlife. And so the Gosford glyphs are very much real, but they come from this time around King Tut and King Akhenaten. And it's interesting because you find in the Egyptian museums, King Tut's boomerang collection. And boomerangs, as we know it, came from the Aborigines in Australia long before anywhere else in the world adapted them. And so this collection comes out of a time frame very similar to or after these trade negotiations had happened in between ancient Kem and Australia, which I imagine were not just a one-up. They continued to do trade there. And so you have these items or objects that you keep finding in the Egyptian museums that really shouldn't be there. Anyway, that's kind of my whole aspect around a lot of my Khemitology studies. But we have a few more. So we also have this tomb of Maya. And Maya is interesting because Maya in the ancient Suf and Khemitology language means water, just like As or Askat does. And so in Saqqara, we have this tomb. But at Elephantine Island and at, which is the center glyph, and at the Temple of Isis at Philae, which is the right-hand glyph, we have this character wearing the feathered serpent head plume, giving gifts to his Khemitology counterparts. And so this character was known as Maya, the character who crossed the water, Maya. And so in his tomb, he's depicted as having the dreadlocks of the ancient, wigs of ancient Kemet, which you see in the lower left-hand corner. They all wore these weird dreadlocky wigs. And he's depicted as a Khemitology. When in Rome, be a Roman, right? But when you're in the tomb of Maya and you go into the secondary room and you pay a little vig, to the guy that has the keys, you go into the second room and you look at the ceiling of the second room, and this is what you see on the left. These are not Egyptian or Khemitology glyphs. These are actually an ancient star calendar system that came from ancient Mayan culture and has actually been studied and looked at by Mayan elders that say this is our ancient language, but we no longer use these glyphs. And it's fascinating because in Peru, we're told that the Inca never had a written language system either. They used quipu, these knotted systems, and they're runners that would run on these trails through the Andes. That I know you've been to Peru, Walter, and some of these trails are crazy. They're like stumps of rock or wood that are slammed on the side of a cliff with a 2,000-foot drop off. And these people are running these things, taking these quipu from village to village and kingdom to kingdom. Yeah. But Brian Forrester and I found in the Cusco Museum this tapestry. And people just look at it as, it's just a regular tapestry of glyphs. Well, none of the glyphs are uniform in how they're portrayed in the tapestry. And so Brian and I came to the conclusion that this was the actual written language, similar to the star map that we see from the Mayan language of the ancient Inca. And so there is a possibility that they actually had a written language. But thanks to the conquistadors and all that happened during those time periods, we may never know because a lot of their ancient history was destroyed.
Yeah, the conquistadors and the church.
And the church. Well, even in the ancient Khemitology times, the Akhenaten rulership was destroyed by the Hanuti priests, and so this is kind of where you have the Exodus, where half of them fled, into Israel and Jordan and that whole area. And Akhenaten's daughter Marataten left with her Druidic priests and fled to Ireland and Scotland. And so she was known in Scotland as Scotia. And this is where the Druids and the Scotia come from. And it's interesting because this kind of leads into some of your research, I think, around the Tuatha De Danann, because there could be a direct connection to ancient Kemet with them as well through Druidic cultures. Anyway, that's my part of my lecture. I've got a lot more slides here, but they're not as interesting as some of the Khemitology connections that we've gone through.
Well, that's I love when slides are shown. That just really it's awesome. It enriches what you're talking about, what we're talking about here. So I thank you for presenting.
No.
And I think what we're going to do now is go into some questions. You got time for questions?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah, let me start. Let me kick off with the first question. Going back to your time in Nepal.
Okay.
You spoke a couple days ago that you had some interesting or mystical experiences while in Nepal. What were some of those?
So I moved to Nepal when I was 4 years old. I turned 5 slightly after I moved to Nepal. And slightly after that, my father took my sister and I up into a village called Sikrung, or Sirung, which is located in the Manung Valley in Gorkha district. This is where one of the 2 major earthquakes in 2015 took place. And this village literally hangs out over the valley below. It's sitting on the top of the cliff. It takes about 9 hours to climb from the Riverside Trail all the way up to the village, which is an incredibly long day. And in the village, during the harvest festival of the Shai, which takes place in September, my sister and I were the guests of honor. My parents were there in the 1970s. My dad did his doctoral dissertation in this village. And so they always were curious why my parents never had children. And so 5 years later, 6 years later, we come back to Nepal as the children. And so we became the guests of honor. And during the ceremony, we were introduced to the village shaman practice, all the magic and mysticism of the village. During this time of year, it's very foggy. So you wake up in the fog of the Himalayas. There's a lot of mysticism with the fog. And eventually, the village shaman did this whole seance of sorts around the buffalo that would have been slaughtered in our honor. And he did this by entrancing the buffalo with a series of dance moves using a katana sword. And it's interesting because the katana doesn't exist in Nepal. It's very much Japanese. And so the katana sword was taken from a Brunei officer, or a Japanese officer in Brunei, which was one of the bloodiest ground battles during World War II. And if anybody of you have ever seen The Man Who Would Be King, there's a famous scene in it with a Gurkha soldier where he rips out his kukri and he runs into battle yelling, "Ayo Gurkhali!" They were ruthless. They did not.
Billy Fish.
They did not care.
Billy Fish is his name.
Oh, right. Yeah. And so this shaman entranced the buffalo. The buffalo then eventually lowers his head. And with a spin and one swipe, the shaman took the entire head of the buffalo off with the sword. Then all that meat is shared amongst everybody in the village. Everybody is blessed upon. There's lots of puja that goes on. All of your plows and farming equipment, anything that has an engine, a bicycle, any of these things, they're all blessed with the blood of this animal. So depending on your status in Kathmandu or in the villages, you'll either slaughter a buffalo, a chicken, or a cow. A buffalo, a chicken, or a goat, not a cow. And these become, the elements that you bless all your items with. It's interesting that this is the harvest festival. So this is when Saturn comes out. And so you then plant all your next year's seeds in the spring when Saturn is starting to wane. And this becomes, more of this spiritual aspect. So there's a lot of spiritualism going on. I hope I answered
And that theme, of course, is depicted in a way at the end of Apocalypse Now.
Oh, God, yes.
Is a story all about transformation of the soul, the individual, the killer becoming the new king or whatever.
I've never actually considered that.
Yeah.
So coming out of that at the age of 5, I had some pretty profound, internal spiritual things that I didn't deal with till years later.
Really?
I was fascinated with these katana blades that ended up in the villages. I inquired, how can I buy one of these? How can I get my hands on one of these? Because I knew its significance. I actually have one. It's in my closet behind me. I should pull it out here in a minute, but we'll figure that out in a second. Because I went back to the villages and I inquired and I inquired and I inquired, and the village headmaster realized that this sword was priceless in a sense. It was something of history. And when the Maoist insurgency came through in the late 90s, early 2000s, they knew that a lot of these villagers were Gurkha soldiers and had weapons in the village. And so they swept through the villages and collected all the weapons. Wow. And the women knew that these swords were priceless. And so they would take the swords and a lot of the weapons out of the villages and take them into the nettle fields where no man wants to go, because, as I've said before, if you've ever been in a nettle field and been stung by stinging nettles, it's not a pleasant experience. But the women would go into the nettle fields because they do their, moon rituals in the nettle fields. But they also use the nettle fields to collect the nettles, which they use for tea, which is very high, rich in iron and other minerals. And they use this also as an achar for the food that they present. And so years later, I went back to the village with my father. I was probably, God, I want to say 11 or 12 years old. And we inquired about the sword again. And a character from the next village over said, "Oh, I have one. And I don't mind giving it up." And so he ran to the next village. Hours later, he came back with his katana. And I took possession of it. I've spent the last 20 years restoring it slowly.
Wow.
And one of my friends who works at a sushi restaurant here gave me the polishing stones that they use for sushi knives. And he said, when you get to a point, make a paste with this and use it to rub into the stone. And this will remove a lot of the external blemishes that are left and allow you to polish it up. Eventually, I want to get to a point, and I say this because it's covered in creosote. So creosote is like what happens when basically they would have the sword above the mantle of the front door of the house, and there's no ventilation from the kitchen of the house. So everything, all the smoke pours out through the front door of the house. And so all that smoke would accumulate up in the rafters and create this black goo, this creosote of sorts that would sit there. And so I've been basically removing all this creosote from the sword. Eventually I want to remove the 3 pins that are in it, because under the hilt, this is an officer's sword. So if you look at it, it's eel skin wrapped with silver. It's stamped, which is interesting. It has a number on it, so I could look up the number, which I'm getting to eventually. But I want to get into the base of the sword so that I can remove the hilt and see remove the handle and see the hilt, because it will tell me who the sword's family was, who it was made for, who made it, and who that person was an apprentice to. And so there's 3 glyphic kanji or hiragato glyphs that will be underneath that. And eventually, I want to return the sword to Japan and take it back to its family, because I don't want to possess it. You were saying artifacts that have spiritual, spiritual possession with them. This one definitely does, and it's followed me around for a bit. And so this is kind of that spiritual aspect of growing up in Nepal. I mean, I grew up around the burning ghats as well. Yes. And so when people are cremated, they're cremated at the burning ghats. And during specific times of year around Shiva Ratri and other times, these areas are very spiritual, because the fog comes in, and with the fog comes all the spirits. And so I was talking with Bernie last week about, characters that come out of this. And there's one that's called the Pishab or Pishanja, which is a vampiric character, supposedly, that's a flesh eater that will go around the burning ghats at night and eat the remaining flesh of the bodies that are still remaining there and burning. And so it's interesting because Pishab sounds a lot like Pisab or Pishwar, which is the word for piss. And so they have this odor to them that smells like urine or death in a sense. And so this is the spirituality around a lot of Kathmandu. Anyway, on to other questions.
We've got one. Old Gaffer, if you could reframe the question and give us a little more context. I think back when you were talking, I'm not sure what it was you were talking about when he asked, could this be the answer to UFOs or one of them anyway? So try to, Old Gaffer, ask the question again with a little more context. Marcos Toledo with a comment. Not a new idea. It was mentioned in an article in either Time or Newsweek that the textiles might have been Inca writing that was in the last century. Yeah, that was referring to the Meru.
Oh yeah, on the tapestry. Yes.
Yeah. So,
but it's not a new idea, but academia literally ignores it because it doesn't. It doesn't fit within their narrative. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we here at the Walter Bosley channel, we thumb our noses at some things academia.
Quackademia is.
Yeah, exactly. Griffin Eagle 7. Hans, have you researched the Canary Islands and its ally?
I have not. No, I have not. I would be very fascinated too. What is the reference with the Canary Islands? I'm curious. I'll have to look
I don't know. I think it's just because they're also very interesting as well.
Yes, Carmen Bolter, correct. Yep.
Yeah.
So she worked at the University of Alberta in the anthropology department at the same time my father worked there, 92 to 93. Actually, it was 93 to 94. Basically, they worked in the same department. I didn't know who she was. She's very interesting. So DJ interviewed her. Yeah, he's interviewed her a few times. I was at Saqqara in 1982 when you only paid bakshish. Well, yeah. Nowadays, you still have to pay bakshish, but they do it through a lot of the tourist industry. You always pay the guy with the keys. They always have the belt of keys. And they will take you into places that most tourists will never go into for the right price. And when you go into, especially the Serapeum at Saqqara, the most fascinating site I've ever been to in my life.
Really?
You have these 100-ton boxes that are perfectly aligned to north, not magnetic north, sitting in 28 alcoves, although 2 of them are empty because 2 of the boxes were abandoned during construction. And they're sunken down 6 feet into the earth. And the question is, A, how do they dig out these tunnels? Because this is bedrock. And as we know from the mining experiences, when you're digging into bedrock, you get a lot of crystal particulate, which creates miner's lung, which shreds your lungs and you die a very painful, and it's like asbestos poisoning, but with crystal rock. And so they weren't using lights. They weren't using torches. How are they removing all this material? How are they building the alcoves? And then lastly, how are they moving these boxes in, turning them and positioning them 6 feet down into the alcove at perfect precision? And you get to one of the hallways. Actually, I think I have it in my screens here. You get to one of these hallways, and you have one of these 100-ton boxes. It's unfinished. It hasn't been finished. And it's sitting in this hallway, and there's literally 2 feet of clearance on one side of this box to get by it. Well, 100 tons, folks, would take, without the use of pulleys, because we don't know if they had them or not, 100 tons is 200,000 pounds. Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a lot of weight. That would take 2,000 people to move. When you go into Saqqara, into the Serapeum, where would you fit 2,000 people? How are you moving these 100-ton boxes of precision into these alcoves and perfectly aligning them?
Yeah.
How are you doing this? 2,000 people would not fit down there, especially if in one of the hallways you have 2-foot clearance on one side of these 100-ton boxes that was just left there in the hallway as if to say, well, we did it, but we're not going to tell you how. And so, yeah, Carmen's been into some very interesting spots. It's really sad that she passed away during COVID, but she had some very interesting and intriguing knowledge. And if you ever watch the Pyramid Code, you know, a lot of what I've learned out of her knowledge and out of Hakeem's knowledge has been very fascinating. Has definitely influenced a lot of stuff. So, what is the connection to the Canaries?
The Canaries is. Oh, I'm sorry. You were finishing what you were saying, or were you reading?
I'm done. No, I was just reading the bottom of the screen.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We were talking about the Canary Islands.
Saying there's an Egyptian connection with the Canaries and something about the Basque mummies.
Oh, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Yeah, not at all. Yeah.
D Light asked, "Do you think the boxes are geopolymer?"
No.
Okay.
Geopolymer. The only things that I would think on the sites that I've been to that could be geopolymer are some of the limestone blocks that you find at Giza or at some of the older sites, because limestone you could make into a slurry, and you could also make into a strong cement base. There's a French geologist who thinks this is possibly how the pyramids were made. If you go to Peru in South America, there's also a thought that geopolymer was used there. But when you start looking at the stone that was being used, I'm not entirely sure that was the case. But geopolymer is very, very interesting and needs to be looked into a lot more because, you know, over time, something that's been cemented will definitely petrify and become more solid, as we see with trees and with bone structures and other things.
Okay. I think you answered this one from Mike Does. How do you know they're not concrete or geopolymer?
We honestly don't know. There would have to be more research done. Sadly, the Department of Antiquities, run by Zahi Hawass, at least it used to be, but he still has his fingers in the pot. They won't allow you to do any research outside of their timeline outside of what they've already deciphered. And so it's very hard to get grants to do any research in a lot of these places. As important, what do you think they were, the Serapeum boxes? Okay, so the Serapeum boxes are interesting. They're called the Serapeum because, or it's called the Serapeum because of the seraph bull. Supposedly there was a mummified bull found in one of the boxes, but this is not true. So there are two sites at the Serapeum. There's the old site, which are these ancient 100-ton boxes that are, perfectly aligned, perfectly cut. I mean, perfectly to some degree. They're not 100% perfect, but they're more perfect than the human eye and the human hand can produce. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. And then there's a secondary room, which is why you pay the guy with the keys to go in this, which are a newer site, but not as perfectly aligned and perfectly constructed. And this is where they found the burial of one bull. And so the thought is that this whole site was a burial for bulls. Even though they dynamited most of the boxes, they found absolutely nothing inside of them. And so all these boxes were hermetically sealed. And so there is a thought that they knew of an ancient cataclysm coming, depending on when these were built. Unfortunately, I don't think they were built within the timeline that we're given, because a lot of this comes out of biblical scholarship and out of the Greek rendition of Egypt and Egyptian history. I think they're much older because there's no inscriptions down there at all. I think this was a time capsule of a sorts and possibly a seed vault, because if you were to hermetically seal these boxes, you could keep seeds within each of these boxes for eons and decades. We're doing this right now in Norway. We have a massive seed vault in Norway. In Peru, they did this as well. So the traders would come to Peru, and people would ask them, what is the elevation or climate of where you're from? And so they'd tell the ancient Inca or even the cultures before that, and they'd be like, oh, okay, well, you need this kind of quinoa because this grows at this altitude, and you need this kind of corn because this grows at this altitude, and that's what they were using their own seed vaults for. But I think the Serapeum boxes were used as time capsules or seed vaults.
Okay. Marie asks, how much generally must you pay to see the other places? I think that's a reference to
paying the VIG.
Yeah.
Couple hundred or a couple £1,000, depending. And this is Egyptian pounds. So, you're looking at $20 to $100. That way you're skirting around the guards. You're not going to get arrested for going into places you shouldn't go into. They all share the money amongst themselves. So it's like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge buddy system. You do this at the not the Osiris shaft, but the Osirian. Usually they don't let you go down into the Osirian, but you definitely bribe the guard a little bit, and they give you 1 minute. You have 1 minute, and so you run down into the Osirian and you take all the photos you can, and you go up some of the side tunnels and into the side rooms, and then you look at the Flower of Life motif. That there's actually 6 of them on one wall, and it's funny. Not bashing Nassim Haramein, but he was there on a tour with friends of mine, and his whole thing is, they were cut with lasers and this laser precision. And it's like, no, this was during the Ptolemaic period. This was all, they were using the compass and trying to figure this out. And they're clearly made with red ochre. And he was even told this by his tour guide. And he turned and he looked at the camera and said, see, they were cut with laser. And I'm just like, oh God, no. What the heck? No, you were just told they weren't. But, he's got to keep up his narrative that these are
sure.
Advanced technology, and there is evidence of advanced technology, but we don't know what it was. Sorry, so what's this?
D. Dorothy Papineau, in 1985 to 90, I worked with Jamgon Kongtrul III. He was very interested in news in 1990 during the Gulf War because it overlaps another dimension and the major religions.
Okay. So curious where Jamgon Kongtrul was from. Is he a Tibetan? Is he Afghani? What is the connection here?
Yeah, I don't know. D-Light asks, is the Serapeum and Seraphim similar, linguistic roots, I guess? Any correlation that you're aware of?
None that I know of, but that's interesting because the Seraphim were enlightened beings in a sense. Seraph is a connection to light or fire or flame.
Okay.
So a lot of this comes out of the ancient Suf language, and so the Kemetian and Suf languages were very much related. More recently, a lot of the names, as I said, come out of Greek names and etymology as well as Arabic. And so a lot of the Arabic actually also comes out of the Suf language. So there's an overlap there.
Before we forget, old Gaffer, one of our regulars, had asked a question about UFOs.
Yeah, what was that in connection with? Was that my old Dropa story from a couple weeks ago?
No, I think it had something to do with what you were talking about during the Egyptian part. Maybe I don't know, but I'm guessing he never gave us a further clarification. So I'll email you that one.
It could have related to the whole Al-Qaria or Cairo connection to Mars.
Oh yeah. Okay, there you go.
There could be a connection there.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure. You know, the whole UFO situation is very interesting. Part of me thinks that it's interdimensional beings that are coming here. Part of me thinks that they're beings that have been here all along with us, that are, crypto-terrestrials in a sense. But then you look into some of the stories of Buddhist culture mysticism, especially around the story of Gadgad-Savara out of the Lotus Sutra, where he is a very physical being that comes here from Sirius in their legends and lore. I mean, he initially arrives on the astral plane through meditation, but he's challenged to come in physical form. And it's said that he climbs atop his tall tower, his flying palace, a tower of 7 layers, the Mount Meru experience. And with the sounds of hundreds of thousands of musical instruments, he traverses the dimensions of time and space to Earth. Well, hundreds of thousands of musical instruments is a cacophony of noise. This is, the repulsors of an engine flying into the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. So there's very much an extraterrestrial connection with Sirius and the ancient Buddhists, but there also could be with ancient Kemetian and even Atlantean time cultures.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see this question here, Patrick Bateman. Well, we don't have time to go into a long thing there, Patrick, but he wants to know if you could talk anymore on Mount Meru, and it's almost hijacking by the FE PSYOP. Now, I don't know off the top of my head.
I don't know what the FE PSYOP is.
Yeah, Patrick, a little less insider baseball there, and tell us what FE stands for. Maybe we do know what he's referring to, but I don't know what the FE PSYOP is as identified. We'll
fake Egyptian, fake ET. I don't know.
Oh, here we go. D. Dorothy, Jamgon Kongtrul was Tibetan, Kagyu lineage, and one of the Karmapa's heart sons, students. Yeah,
interesting.
Okay.
So my curiosity is what overlap with the Gulf War was this? There's some interesting overlaps with the Gulf War.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to learn,
especially with the raid on the Baghdad Museum and all the Sumerian cuneiform cylinder seals that were stolen and ended up in some very interesting collections around the world.
I have an interesting story about my time in Iraq.
Oh, I forgot you were there. That's right.
Yeah, and it was kind of funny. I never knew this. We got over there, and I remember specifically driving to the Ziggurat of Ur, right outside of Nasiriyah, and there were souvenir stands or guys just selling, juices,
trinkets, junk,
and trinkets and stuff. And he had several of these helmets, but it was the Darth Vader helmet, not the mask, the helmet, right? The very iconic helmet with the is similar to the samurai style where it goes around, it's angled, but these were replicas of the Darth Vader helmet part of Darth Vader's, mask. And I got a close look at these, and I said to my good friend I was working with, who was the team leader, I said, these look just like the top of the Darth Vader mask, the helmet portion. And he smiled. He says, yeah, they are. Now get this, Saddam's whatever I forgot what he called them, the Royal Guard, I think it was.
They would wear these things.
Yeah, his closest protectors, right? His special soldiers, his elite, their ceremonial uniform included a long brown cloak that would go all the way to the ground, and they would all
They would all wear his Praetorian Guard. Oh wow!
Vader, yeah, his Praetorian Guard. They would wear these ridiculous Darth Vader like costume helmets, and believe me, they took them
minus the mask. So it's interesting because a lot of this actually comes out of samurai culture, and so the helmets were designed specifically to deflect arrows and sword blows, but then they would also wear the mask to frighten their enemies. And so this was always an interesting aspect of the samurai culture. And I think a lot of that comes out of that. I went into my closet here and I wanted to pull out some of these artifacts real quick.
Do it. Yes.
Before we go. So this is an ancient Tibetan sword.
Oh, beautiful.
But it has Kham and Mongolian writing on it. So this is what the horsemen would use as a broadsword that they would then attack people on the ground with.
Okay.
So there's a lot of this ancient, glyphic writing on it as well. So my dad picked this up years and years ago in Nepal, and I have now inherited this. I have a huge kukri collection from Nepal. I've always been fascinated with the Gurkha weaponry. But in this tube is what I was talking about earlier. And so this is a katana from World War II. It was taken off of an officer in Brunei. As you can, it really smells like a campfire because it's all creosote. As you can see, it's littered with this black creosote all over.
Oh yeah.
And I have spent a long time removing the creosote from the hilt. And as you can see, this is silver wrapped eel skin, which is underneath it. Is all the eel skin. And when you get into it, it has markings on it. It's been stamped. But I eventually want to get this down to a point where it doesn't have, all the rust and whatnot on it. This has been used to slaughter so many buffalo and animals in the villages long before I got this. And so I eventually want to get this down to a point where I can remove all of the creosote, repair it, figure out once I remove the pins, there's 3 pins in here, who made this sword and for who. The stamp might also be interesting, but the fact that this is an officer's sword makes it even more fascinating to me, because a lot of times the officers would take their family heirlooms into battle with them as a sense of honor. And so in Brunei, it was a ground battle against the Gurkha soldiers of the British regiments and the Japanese soldiers of, I can't even remember who the emperor was at the time, Hirohito or whatever. Yeah, anyway, sorry if I'm not correct on that one. But
you mean World War II?
Yeah, this is where all that gold, this is where all the gold comes from that Joseph Farrell talks about, the missing gold.
Right. It was Emperor Hirohito.
Yeah. So these were his officers, and they were fighting over Brunei, which is very fascinating. And the Gurkhas slaughtered the Japanese because the Gurkhas have no remorse. They don't have honor. They have honor of their own, but they're from the villages. And so you were talking on one of our last episodes about your experience in the mess hall with the Gurkha, regiments, and then how the food was so bland.
It was actually the British mess hall was just god awful. It was like canned wieners and
bangers and mash
and like a slice of Wonder Bread but the Italian mess hall, it was 5 different pasta dishes, fresh bread, your choice of red or white wine, cheeses. Oh my gosh, yeah. Now, when I first got to Saudi Arabia, we were using the TCNs, the third country nationals, to make our food, which I found interesting because we're an American military camp and they're not using U.S. personnel to make our food. Now, coming from the perspective of a counterterrorism guy, I'm like,
red alert,
having the third country nationals make our food.
Are we all being poisoned?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we go up there, and the first morning that they do this, they're serving French toast, right? Okay, but you walk up with your tray. They got a stack of toasted bread, already toasted, stacked there. They have this vat of yellow milky water, and what that was the eggs and the milk raw, and they were taking the toast, dipping it in the raw
Making
eggs
French
with
toast.
milk, and putting it on your plate. And they thought that, because and then at lunch,
oh God, that's
at lunch it was supposed to be some other type of thing that came. It came out soupy, and that was the first day. And finally, the American people, services, Air Force services handling the food, came in and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" What they were doing was they were just reading the recipes and they were reading the ingredients without paying attention to the recipes. Now, I will say, once our personnel taught them, we had excellent chow, excellent food. The chow, never as good as a Navy chow.
You'd want to keep your forces healthy and energetic. And so I'm surprised that you weren't eating like a staple environment of dalbat, rice, lentils, good protein, good sources of all. Of course not.
Well, a lot of these TCNs, they were Indian. And my gosh, yeah, I would have loved if they were serving us Indian food, more than trying to make American food. What happened was we had a lot of troops because of that. They would just eat MREs. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with an MRE.
Oh, yeah, of course. Military
those are made with enough calories and stuff and carbs to carry you through a whole day. And we had American personnel, clearly their first time in the field, who were eating an MRE each meal.
Interesting. So I used to eat them for lunch. So we get MREs at the commissary in Kathmandu, and they all came out of the Iraq War. A lot of them. My last few years of high school, and it was funny because everything in the MRE was a pork product, which means that if the enemy found this in Iraq, they couldn't eat it because they're all Muslim and they can't eat pork.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like spam and all these crazy things in the MRE, and I found it interesting that in every single MRE, there was a little tiny jar of Tabasco in every single one of them. Oh my God.
Tabasco. The ham steak was one of the most coveted ones.
And chocolate pudding. That was the other one that I thought was funny.
Yeah. Ham steak and the corned beef hash.
Right. Yeah.
I remember everybody wanted to get that when they would trade these things.
I have a question for you about your time in Afghanistan. Obviously, we're going a little over, but that's all right. I mean, information and knowledge is information and knowledge. Did you ever come across stories of Shambala or Shangri-La when you were in Afghanistan? Was any of that ever brought about? I mean, obviously there's chit chatter amongst the troops and amongst the agents or the people in the area. I'd imagine if any of that had ever come up to you.
When I was there, what's frustrating is there are some things I didn't really turn on to until after my time there. I'm sure you know that experience where you're like, oh, had I known.
Why did I think of that? Yeah.
Oh, let me tell you, the stuff that I would have and could have dug into while at Wright Pat, I don't even want to mention because you'll all knock me upside the head for being an idiot. But it's just, I looked at, believe me, I tried to dig up the stuff that came to mind, but at the time, but while I was in Afghanistan, the most I could get out of anyone on things, of interest was that there was a wall. There's this old wall, like kind of mud and stone or whatever, when you go to Kabul, that's kind of around the old perimeter. And it's full of human bones and other sinewy materials and stuff.
As part of the structure of the wall, or
part of the structure of the wall, they would use.
So this is similar to the history of the Great Wall of China. There was a lot of that.
Yeah. So there's that. Now, when I was in Sudan, I came real close to, across from Khartoum, which is where I was working, right across the river, the Blue Nile, I think, because the White and the Blue Niles converge at Khartoum, as you know. Yeah. But when you cross into the old part of Omdurman, which is where the Mahdi lived, and of course the Mahdi Wall is there and all that Gordon stuff. I was real close to being able to first observe a Yazidi exorcism
Oh
of
wow!
a
Oh wow!
demonically possessed individual. It fell through at the last minute, but that contact was going to share with me some other things and show me some sites that the tourists don't get to go to. And when the exorcism thing fell through, all the rest of it fell through. So it wasn't for lack of trying. It was, you know how it is, it depends on how much time you have there. And I would be there a month at a time, but still, it just wasn't able to make that happen.
I brought that up because you had mentioned several podcasts ago that you had left a book on one of the planes coming over the mountains, the last Atlantis book that you'll ever read.
Matlock.
Yeah, great book. Yeah. Thank you for suggesting that. I actually
great
and paid the hefty price to buy it, but it's a great book.
Yeah, it's a short book.
It connects the Vedic society with South and Central America as well as with Egypt, and I've always found this very fascinating. And that's why I was curious if you were into stuff like that while you're flying into Afghanistan.
And
was there another connection there that you would take away?
I would ask my team leader, hey, can we go check this out? Can we check that? Like, for instance, it's like, how far away is the Khyber Pass and how soon can we get there? And he said, yeah, I'd like to go there too, because he's a big nut about this stuff like I am. We would watch, I'm not kidding you, we would watch, you mentioned The Man Who Would Be King.
Right, great movie.
We would watch all or part of that movie every day. If my buddy Eric was there, we would, one of us had brought the DVD, and we would watch part or all of that movie every calendar day that we were there. We could quote the whole thing. He's a big fan of that. So when I mentioned, hey, can we go to the Khyber Pass? He said that he had been there once, but at the time we were there, it was a big threat zone. And there's certain things, even though I was there doing spooky work, even though I'm there during war stuff and all that, there were still some places that we just couldn't go.
Sure.
That was just the nature of that beast. I wanted to go to Ur when I'm up on top of the ziggurat. I'm looking and you can see across the plain, and you see the ruins that they found are in a crevasse.
Oh, how
is it? Like a canyon kind of thing. And I asked him, I said, Eric, can we go to the city? And he goes, no. He goes, we're at the time we were among the few who could go to the ziggurat. From what I understand, since a lot of people, have been able to go there. But he said, they've got that locked down. You really have to have clearance and everything like that. At the time, 2003.
Jimmy Corsetti was there during the Gulf War. I don't know if you know who Jimmy Corsetti is. He's done a lot of stuff. He's another researcher in our field, but his whole thing is about Atlantis being the eye of Africa. He's been on Joe. Yeah, the Rashat structure. He's been on Joe Rogan twice now, I think. But he was stationed in Iraq as well, and he got to go see the gates where they have the famous. It's like the lion that has wings and the head of the human.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You mean in Mosul?
I think that's where it is. Correct. Yeah, and that whole area was destroyed afterward, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was there too. I got a picture of me standing outside those gates, and that was the Nineveh, the old
Nineveh. Correct. Yes.
Nineveh, and that's where, if you're a fan of the original Exorcist, that's where it opens with Father Marin on the archaeological dig. They filmed that there.
How fascinating that would be where
and so I'm standing there looking at this. I'm going, wow, this is familiar. And, I'm thinking, well, maybe I saw it in a book or something, or maybe reincarnation, whatever. But later on, I'm watching The Exorcist. I'm like, no way. So I looked it up, and sure enough. And those gates are really cool. That's part of Saddam's reconstruction to recreate
he felt that he was the reincarnate of Nebuchadnezzar, and so there was that whole weird aspect. I wish I could go to some of these regions. I mean, even today, I'm fortunate for my journeys into Pakistan, because I've never been into Afghanistan. I've been close, I've been all over Pakistan. I've been all over India. I've been to Ladakh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Burma, but I've never been into Afghanistan. So
yeah, I haven't done India yet. Gosh darn it. That's kind of like the first place I ever wanted to go and travel was India. The closest I've been is Pakistan. I worked in Islamabad and briefly in Karachi. And I didn't get to go to Mohenjo-daro.
You've been to Gulistan Market, downtown Islamabad.
Islamabad was really nice. Yeah, it used to be. I think
it's a planned city. And
yeah,
so
it was an Italian colony, or
the city of Balkh in Afghanistan is also very planned, like Afghanistan, where it starts with a central area and then it goes into all these different in these different neighborhoods, like Islamabad does.
Yeah.
So Islamabad was one of the really fascinating places that I've been. We got to go to Peshawar, which is close to the Afghan border. We went up to Murray. Murray's a beautiful area. They turned it into a military base, but there used to be this beautiful Christian school up there. And then we went to like Taxila, which is the last place that Alexander the Great ended up on the Indus Valley. There's a old fort there. And then Rohtas Fort, which is on the border of Kashmir up near Gilgit. And so that whole area is just super beautiful. I would love to go back. But
yeah, it was
hard to get there. Yeah.
You know, I liked my stay in Islamabad. Karachi, you can have.
That's why it's named after a crotch. But you know,
it was pure mission focus while there. Islamabad, we didn't. When we were in Islamabad, we weren't walking around carrying our guns. When we went over to Rawalpindi,
Rawalpindi is a whole different story.
You will have your sidearms. You know,
it's funny because you sit at like G10 or H1 on the outskirts of Islamabad, and you look across the river, and there's Rawalpindi.
Yeah, and you're like, ugh. But and we were told, no uncertain terms, you keep your heads up, your head in the game, you keep that sidearm at hand, and when you're over in Pindi, you know, and it was just, you know, kind of almost the opposite while I was in Islamabad. And every morning they're walking the elephants from the zoo, and the monkeys are all running all over the tree. There's that one road that takes you around through the tree grove near the zoo, and all the monkeys and you know, exotic birds and stuff. It was really cool. But I got to get to India. I got to get to India.
You will. We'll all go. We need to go. We need to do a huge tour of Egypt and a huge tour of India.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before. So,
yeah. I got to get there. We got to do it. So we've gone well over 2 hours, and I think that's enough. We're probably both exhausted, but thank you so much, Hans, for joining us.
I appreciate this time. This has been super enlightening. I thank you for, you know, giving me the podium to talk about some of my research. You know, I need to make a disclaimer. I do my research. I don't borrow from other people. There's been some weird controversy out there recently, but a lot of this is everything that, you know, I've come across in my informational searches. And so I like to hear it, and I like to do topics that a lot of people do not talk about. So
we, unfortunately, in this kind of alternative community, we have our narcissists, and they use that kind of thing. They're usually trying to get in someone's head. Very often, well. Anyway, narcissists, they do their thing for their own ego to self-aggrandize, and so, you know, we kind of have to ignore individuals who
do that. Yeah. But regardless, I appreciate the time.
Sure.
Love the audience. Thanks for the great questions, guys, and I look forward to doing this again. Trying to, you know, a lot of my field of research, because I do graphic design and multimedia full time, it's like I have limited time to get into the esoteric, but I'm trying to look into some other things that interest me about South Asia and the area that I've grown up in, and there's a lot. And so
let's definitely a whole adventure ahead of you still.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people in this area or this field, and so I'm glad that I'm stepping into it. And again, I really appreciate the time that you've given me. So
thanks for coming on, and we're definitely going to have you on again. So
and looking forward to seeing you at
NimzaCon, yeah.
Let your audience know once you get your discount on the hotels there. That would be amazing.
We're in fact, I put in a call this morning. I'm
because that would be super exciting. I've never seen this area of California. I'm super excited. yeah, super excited to come down.
Yeah, you'll like it. We're looking forward to seeing you there. So
awesome. Appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Hans.
Thank you, crowd. Thank you, everybody.
So, okay, folks, that's it. I want to thank you all in the live chat for hanging out. And this was a really, really good, informative show. This is one of the best episodes of our Lost Horizons series. And I want to remind you all to check out walterbosley.com, and NIMSACon tickets are available there. And also, please check out Code 12, the film that I'm in. And if you do decide to choose one of the options and purchase a viewing of the film, please do it through walterbosley.com. And I think you'll like it. I think you'll find it very interesting. So again, thank you, everybody, especially all you new folks that this might be your first time here. We welcome you, and please, by all means, check out the other videos and come back next time. So thanks again, everyone, and we will see you next time.